President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I know senators are waiting on movements on both sides, but I just want to reiterate what I said earlier this afternoon. We have before us, in fact, there's a message from the House and the Omnibus. I would point out that both Republicans and Democrats have had an enormous amount of input into this for over the past several months. I know that because the Appropriations Committee staff has worked so hard on it, again, on both sides of the aisle. Earlier today, I put into the record the names of members of my staff who have worked on this. I would just mention to other senators, there are many times I'd be on phone calls with them and conference calls at 10 and 11 o'clock at night. I could then go to bed. They were still there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I know the number of them and giving up times with their families over the weekend. I'd be checking in with them or come down and meet with them, but I could go home. They kept on working. I think we have to understand that if it was not for such dedicated staff members, this Senate could not exist. We have complex matters before us. But in a way, what we have here is a simple matter. Everybody has had input into it. As chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I've tried to make it open to everybody. The vice chairman, Senator Shelby, a close friend of mine, has done the same on his side. People have heard. Now comes a time when we have to vote. The government runs out of money at midnight tomorrow. Look what faces our country. We, as the leading democracy in the world, are trying to stand up to Ukraine. I applaud Senator Biden. He and I sometimes joke when I came here, I was accused of, because I was 34 years old, presiding officer can understand this feeling. I was accused by a very senior senator of being too young to be in the United States Senate. Fortunately, I was not the youngest. The youngest was Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware. And we formed a bond over that, and we worked together on so many things. I watched him on the Foreign Relations Committee. I watched him in Judiciary. And I watched him as Vice President and now as President. I've seen him tirelessly, quietly, a lot of it not in the full light of the press, but just doing what he has to do, calling leaders who respect him around the world, forming a coalition in Ukraine, and to say, here's how we'll stand up against Russia. I know so many of the Russian people who are good people, but being led by a person who has demonstrated activities which makes him a war criminal. What has happened when mothers, fathers, and their children are machine gunned to death on the streets of the city they grew up in by Russian invaders. This is a war crime when Vladimir Putin sends them there. And in this omnibus, we have support for the Ukrainian people. Let's stand up. Let's deliver the support. Let's do what we should do. Let the Senate be the conscience of the nation. Let's not have a dozen or more amendments that are designed more for, here's how I can get on 30 seconds on the news or in a Twitter account or somewhere. Let's do what's best for this country. And let's do what's best for the people in Ukraine. Look at the lies. Look at the lies that have come out of Russia. I don't say it lightly after 48 years here to call the leader of our country a war criminal. But Vladimir Putin has been a war criminal. He's been a war criminal in having people go in and do the horrible crimes, blowing up maternity hospitals while women are giving birth, killing children, bombing schools, destroying families, innocent civilians. For what? To return a dream of a Soviet Union that never existed? To return a dream of being a modern-day czar when that's not something you really want to be? No. Mr. President, and let us as senators, Republicans and Democrats, stand up and say, okay, we're going to do our job. We're going to vote for legislation. We're going to vote for appropriations that helps the President of the United States stand up and help the people in Ukraine. We all know what we're going to do. We all know what the stakes are. We all know what's here. Let's stop the press releases. Let's stop the grandstanding. Let's stand up and vote. Vote yes or vote no. Don't stand behind something where you say, well, I might be judged this way or I might be judged that way in a vote. Just as the presiding officer has cast tough votes, we all do. I voted 17,000 times on this floor. I was proud to do it. Was I right in every single vote? I'm sure I could go back over those and say, what was I thinking? But I tried to do what was best. We know what's best now. Fund our government. Pay for our young people. Pay for our schools. Pay for our nutrition. Pay for feeding Americans, but also pay for helping Ukrainians who are standing up against a war criminal. We all proudly say we stand for democracy and the ideals of democracy. Let's do it. People of Ukraine are. When I think of the malignant, lying, terrorist things that come from Russia against the proud people of Ukraine, I think of the Putin group calling President Zelensky a Nazi. He's Jewish and proud of it. He couldn't be further away from being a Nazi. He's a man who could have fled his country as so many of these others have. He stayed there to protect his country, to stand with his country. Shouldn't we stand with him too? I think we should. So I'd urge my Senate colleagues, come in here. You go home and talk about how I voted for this, I voted for that. Well, come and vote. Come and vote. Let's get this bill passed. Mr. President, I'll probably say more as we go forward in this. I know there are other senators, like the distinguished senior senator of Michigan who's about to speak. And I will yield the floor on this, but I've been here and had to vote over and over. As I said, I voted 17,000 times. I think there's only one person in history who's voted more than that. These haven't all been easy votes. I've had to wrestle with my conscience in them. But I go back to one of the first critical votes I cast. As the newest, as the most junior member of the Senate, 34-year-old member of the Senate, a junior most member of the Armed Services Committee, and we were asked to vote to continue the war in Vietnam. I campaigned against the war in Vietnam, and ironically enough, at that time, the majority in Vermont supported the war. I did not. In my own conscience, I did not. And so we had 5 votes in committee to continue it. Each time, the vote to continue it failed by 1 vote. I was the newest and youngest member of that committee, and I voted no. I became the only Vermonter ever to vote to end the war in Vietnam. And I was told that would end my Senate career. I was done. I think back 48 years to that time. And I know at the end of this term I will leave. I'll leave on my own accord, not because of a vote I cast. Every one of us should know, cast what's right in your conscience. Cast what's right in your conscience. That's worth more than an election. And we should vote for this, get it done, show Ukraine that the greatest democracy and the longest lasting democracy currently in the world, the United States, stands with you. And I will. So with that, I see my friend.
Wait a minute. Thank you.
Mr. President, I will yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Excuse me, Mr. President. I yield back.
You're not that short. Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that it be in order to call up the following amendments to the motion to concur with an amendment: Lee, 4989, Braun, 4990, Kennedy, 4983. That they be the only remaining amendments in order to the House message on H.R. 2471. That at 8:30 today, the Senate vote in relation to the amendments in the order listed. That upon disposition of the amendments, the motion to refer and the motion to concur with an amendment be withdrawn, and the Senate vote on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2471. And with 60 affirmative votes required for adoption of Kennedy, 4983, and the motion to concur, with 2 minutes for debate equally divided between each vote, and all votes after the first vote be 10 minutes. And finally, that the motion to concur is agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, across America, our schools are open and our children are back in the classroom, and that's great news for everyone. Unfortunately, providing our children healthy food has been a real challenge for schools, thanks to supply chain challenges that are happening in many places, in every state. This chart shows the supply chain disruptions across the country, with the red being almost 100% of the schools having supply chain challenges and disruptions. Over 90% of the schools in the majority of the country are having challenges just buying the food they need for the children. That's why during the pandemic, Congress made sure schools and meal providers had flexibility to continue to feed hungry children. 90% of our schools from rural Alaska to downtown Louisville are still relying on these flexibilities to keep their children fed. Extending these bipartisan tools and the Omnibus package is essential to helping schools ease back into regular operations for our children. Nutrition operations at schools are working hard. They're working as hard as they can to get back to normal. But it takes time, and the waivers help. When basic staples like chicken and whole grains cost double, waivers help schools in Caribou, Maine, for instance, keep feeding kids. When supply chain limits available food options like ground beef or fruit, schools in Bismarck, North Dakota, for instance, can use substitutions to put together healthy lunches. And hunger doesn't go away just because school's out. Thanks to these waivers, communities from Michigan to Kentucky to Utah were able to feed more children over the summer, particularly in rural communities. If schools or meal providers are unable to serve meals because of ongoing challenges, that hurts all of our children. Over 2,000 groups from the School Nutrition Association to Feeding America to local school boards and superintendents and administrators have all called on Congress to do what's right and extend these waivers. I would like to enter these letters in the record without objection.
Without objection.
We all want life to get back to normal. Right now, we need our Republican colleagues to support the bipartisan tools that will help get us there. This amendment is a short extension. There's a clear end date when schools will be back to normal operations. But in the meantime, these waivers are key to helping schools stay open and operate in person for our children. Taking these waivers away would leave schools and summer meal programs scrambling, and that hurts up to 30 million kids who eat school meals. 30 million kids. Small rural schools and their students would undoubtedly be hurt the worst. It's time for Congress to stand with our schools and with our children. So would the senator agree to modify his request to include a vote in relation to Stabenow Amendment 4994?
Is there objection to the modification? Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, speaking on behalf of Leader McConnell, and with all due respect to my friend from Michigan, this is a COVID-related provision which the Biden administration never requested. It's not in the president's budget. It's not even in the supplemental budget. The administration asked for everything under the sun, but they never asked for this. This is another example of my colleagues trying to take an emergency pandemic, the exemptions, and turn them into permanent changes that last forever. Families don't want schools to be permanently stuck in pandemic posture. Families want schools to move past COVID and get back to normal. Yet this amendment would continue policies that were explicitly designed to help schools close and go viral. That's exactly what families don't want. Parents and kids want schools open. Finally, this amendment cost $11 billion, and it's not offset. And for the people watching this tonight, that means it's not paid for. It's $11 billion more that we can't afford. We had a fully paid for COVID package ready to go until the House Democrats blew it up. We'll not be going around the backs of our own Senate committees of jurisdiction because House Democrats killed a bipartisan COVID package. So, Mr. President, I respectfully object.
Objection is heard to the modification.
Mr. President.
Is there objection to the original request? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Now, Mr. President, in the last 4 days alone, the United States Senate has passed a sweeping postal reform bill, unanimously approved anti-lynching legislation, approved emergency aid to Ukraine, and now we're about to fully fund the government. From start to finish, it's been a very productive and very bipartisan week in the Senate. If we could boil down this week to 3 words in the Senate, they would be productive, bipartisan, successful. In a few moments, the Senate will pass the strongest, boldest, and most significant government funding package we've seen in a long time. This bipartisan funding package is a significant and far-reaching win for the American people. And I'm glad the Senate moved quickly today as I hoped we would. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I say bravo, a job well done. We're keeping our promise to support Ukraine as they fight for their lives against the evil Vladimir Putin. With nearly $14 billion in emergency aid, Congress will approve more than double what the administration originally requested. We took the President's original request for Ukrainian aid, examined it, and added to it. And every last penny of the money will be well spent. We're giving the Ukrainians billions for food, medicine, shelter, and support for the over 2 million refugees who have had to leave Ukraine, as well as funding for weapons transfers like Javelins and Stingers. We're going to reassure and strengthen NATO and add teeth to our defenses against Russia's malicious cyber warfare. We promised the Ukrainian people they would not go at it alone in their fight against Putin. And once we pass this funding in a short while, we will keep that promise. On the domestic front, this funding bill is awash with good news for our country. We're about to give our troops a pay raise. We're increasing funding for our schools and Head Start programs and Pell Grants. We're reviving, at last, the Violence Against Women Act. We're kickstarting the President's Cancer Moonshot. And with this package, we will unlock billions upon billions to fully fund the bipartisan infrastructure law. Of course, we didn't get everything we hoped for. In the weeks ahead, we absolutely must work to secure more COVID money. COVID funding is about being prepared. By funding vaccines and therapeutics and testing, we'll be ready for the next variant and stand a better chance of keeping schools open and preserving normality in our daily lives. We're going to keep working on this. It's too important to ignore. Now, as we reach the finish line, I want to sincerely thank Chairman Leahy and Ranking Member Shelby. What a fitting and worthy accomplishment as they near the end of their tenures in office. I've always said, from my first day as Majority Leader, that Democrats would be willing to work in a bipartisan way to get things done whenever we could. Once the Omnibus passes, the Senate will have sealed the deal on 3 major bipartisan accomplishments this week alone. Of course, when we're unable to find common ground, Democrats will hold firm in defense of our values and be willing to work alone if needed. But this week, bipartisanship has propelled us over the finish line. It's not been easy to put this package together, but we're moments away from getting it done, and I thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle. I yield the floor.
Senator from Indiana.
The Majority Leader referred to what we're doing this evening as awash with good news. Well, it's also awash with earmarks. They have not been around for over 10 years, and we're bringing them back. I'm going to call up an amendment here in a bit that's going to talk about what to do about them. But I think you need to have a backdrop of what we're doing here this evening. I'm on the Budget Committee, and I don't think we did a budget resolution, and I don't think we've done a budget for over 10 years. This is the biggest business in the world that now is spending close to $5 trillion, only 1.5 of it that's even subject to review, because the one ingenious thing that we've done here, if you believe in big government, is put it all on autopilot, on mandatory spending. That's what drives the government currently, and that means that the Budget Committee is a useless appendage because we don't use it anymore. I got here a little over 3 years ago. we were $18 trillion in debt. Now we're over $30 trillion in debt, and everyone seems to shrug their shoulders. That's not a good business plan for Americans to be borrowing money, even if it has good stuff in it, when it's for consumption. It'll only end up in a hard reconciliation down the road. Now let's talk about earmarks. It's kind of a gateway drug to more spending. 367 pages of earmarks. Just took a quick poll how much it weighs in paper, 4 to 5 pounds. Haven't had them for over 10 years. Now they're back. In the House, they said they're okay with it. In the Senate, the other side of the aisle said they're okay with it. We said we're not okay with it in our Republican conference, but any senator can do it anyway. Those are called gimmicks and loopholes, and that's the way the place works. No one's sure how much money is actually being devoted to these. It's a wasteful tool that was away for a long time, and it's on top of a budget that was never done, and what we're doing this evening was supposed to have been done by September 30th of last year. Too many people depend on this place to have a system that's run by the seat of its pants. You bring the earmarks back, well, there's supposed to be a few rules to go with them. You're supposed to make them public 2 days before you actually have to vote on them. Well, that didn't happen. The text was released at 1:30 a.m. yesterday. 2,700 pages. The House passed it only after 20 hours of review. That's at the rate of about having to come up with finding out $1 billion a minute of what's in it. Members are supposed to have a financial disclosure attached to any earmark. That hasn't happened either. Just one of those simple details that seem to never get attended to in this place. Let's look at a few of the doozies. One earmark spends $500,000 to promote health equity in Yonkers, in New York. One spends $1.6 million for university research into equitable shellfish aquaculture. I don't know what that is, but it's in Rhode Island. One earmark spends $300,000 on the Alliance for Gun Responsibility Foundation, a left-wing lobbying group that claims that the Second Amendment has a history of being used as a tool of white supremacy. 3 samples of hundreds and hundreds of earmarks. It's not what the American public deserve. They expect more out of us. Should be a merit-based system on what we spend here. It should be going through regular order on the budget committee I'm on, where you bring people in to testify, do you actually need more money? What you did spend the year before, was it spent well? That's the way all other places in this country do it, because it's the only thing that works. Here, the system has been so degraded, this is what we end up with. I'll end with this. Most of my colleagues here, I think, view this place as a growth business. But a growth business is based on a few things. You generally make a profit. That's not what this is about, but you'd balance your budget. You do things that make sense year after year. And when you're spending money that constitutes almost 20% of our GDP, you think you'd put more into it than dropping 2,700 pages in our lap and thinking that you can get through it. And for those that want more of this, for the sake of the institution, you ought to be concerned about what it's going to look like down the road when we add another $1.5 trillion in debt to our current $30 trillion, and there's no end in sight. A lot of stories have been written throughout history where that ends up, and it's in the ditch. The Medicare Trust Fund is completely exhausted in about 4.5 years. 18% benefit cuts when that happens. Actuarially, we've known the Social Security Fund is going to go broke in about 10 or 11 years. What will we do? We'll probably wait until the year before it happens, not make any other reforms, and then borrow the money to backfill it and put more and more obligation on our kids and our grandkids. I'm going to call up my amendment in a bit. I'll yield the floor at this time.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I call up my amendment number 4989 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
Senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes amendment number 4989.
Mr. President, a few short months ago, President Biden issued a series of executive orders. These executive orders issued by the Biden administration imposed some pretty sweeping mandates on the American people, mandates insisting that covered persons, including for our purposes today, military employees, federal workers, employees of businesses with government contracts with the federal government, and medical professionals who contract with CMS, basically anyone involved with the provision of services through Medicare or Medicaid, must get the COVID-19 vaccine on condition of termination. The way these mandates worked is particularly nasty, especially if they work for one of the private companies, as is the case with the CMS and independent contractor mandates. If they don't fire all their workers who don't get vaccinated, then they basically are rendered out of business. Yeah, the federal government was going to just impose these crippling costs that no corporation could afford to carry. They knew that this was creating a big issue and that this would force people into getting vaccinated. Here's the problem with that, Mr. President. Now, I want to be clear. I've been vaccinated. My family's been vaccinated. I believe the vaccines have made things safer and healthier for hundreds of millions of people. I also believe that, like any medical procedure, it's not without risk, particularly to some people who might have extreme sensitivities, who might have an idiosyncratic response to the vaccine. And so it's not right to force this on everyone and to render those who refuse to get it not only unemployed, but unemployable. I've received communications from countless people. For example, military professionals, military officers and enlisted personnel who have worked for the U.S. military for nearly 2 decades, who are actually coming up on retirement, who are saying that for one reason or another, they don't want to get the vaccine. Sometimes it's religious, other times it's based on a history of poor reactions to other vaccines or a prior medical condition that they believe would cause them to respond poorly, or based on natural immunity. They don't want to get the vaccine, and they're being told that in the case of military personnel, if they don't get it, then they will not receive an honorable discharge. This could render them not only unemployed, but unemployable. And that's the case for many, many others subject to these overreaching mandates. Look, Mr. President, if we decided as a country that this was good policy, then good policy, like all good policy, should be embodied in law. In my copy of the Constitution, in the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article, says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 7 makes the point even clearer. It says, in order to pass a law within the federal system and have it be a federal law, it has to be proposed in one body or the other, but it has to be the same legislation passed by both houses prior to its presentment to the president for signature, veto, or acquiescence. In this case, we've had none of those things. No, instead, you've had unilateral executive action taken by the president and those working within his administration. In the process, they've bypassed the thing that this set of mandates is largely unnecessary, dramatically overreaching, not within the executive power granted to the executive branch of government by the United States Congress, and is fundamentally immoral in addition to being wildly and increasingly unpopular. You see, the little secret is people don't like the government doing things that are immoral. And all of us understand that you don't render someone unemployed, unable to put bread on the table for their children, simply because they won't bow to presidential medical orthodoxy. That's not right, that's not American, it's not constitutional. But more than anything, it's not moral. We all know deep down that this is not right. This is not something any of us would want to do. Not one of us would want to show up and tell our own employees, you know, if you don't do what I say with regard to a medical procedure you may not want, and as to which you might have legitimate, sincere religious objections, or that might be unnecessary because you've got natural immunity. Natural immunity, which, by the way, recent studies have confirmed, natural immunity is at least as good as, and according to many studies released by many countries and studies in the possession of our own government, are indicated to be at least as powerful as, and in many cases more powerful than, the immunity achieved through the vaccine. None of us would do that to a friend, a neighbor, our own employee, because we know it would be wrong, it would be mean, it would be unkind. You can't atone for the unkindness and the immorality in that by claiming it's okay because it's through the government, especially not when the President of the United States is flouting, circumventing the Constitution of the United States. We have a chance to make this right. Yeah, over time, sadly, Senates and House of Representatives and White Houses of every conceivable partisan combination have contributed to this because, yes, we've given executives too much power. I complained about it during the previous administration in response to specific actions taken by the previous president, who was a member of my own party, sometimes at great personal expense, because I believe Congress has given the executive too much power. It's bad, it's harmful, it's dangerous. We have to stop it somewhere. But we have a chance right now, we have a shot with something that is wildly unpopular and inherently immoral. And that shot exists with not funding it. We don't have to fund that part of government that goes to fund these dangerous, immoral, unconstitutional vaccine mandates. We shouldn't do it. I encourage all of my colleagues, all within the sound of my voice, please end this madness now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
I'll be very brief. There are two reasons why senators should vote against the Lee anti-vaccination amendment that affects our dedicated healthcare workers and our superlative military. First, vaccines for healthcare workers protect the most vulnerable, particularly seniors and those with chronic illness. 3 in 4 COVID deaths in America were seniors. 200,000 were people living in long-term care. Vulnerable people are safer when their homes, hospitals, and doctors' offices are safer. Furthermore, flu shot requirements for healthcare workers were already common. Health workers know vaccinations are part of the job. Turning to the armed forces, Mr. President, I'm simply going to quote the letter General Milley wrote with respect to the vaccination requirement. Here's General Milley. We need each and every soldier, airman, Marine, and Guardian healthy and capable of performing our duties. COVID-19 is a threat to force, protection, and readiness. General Milley went on to say, with this in mind, the Secretary of Defense intends to mandate vaccinations for all service members. And then he makes it clear the Joint Force medical professionals recommend this as a necessary step to sustain our readiness and protect our force, our coworkers, our families, and our communities, unquote. For these reasons, Mr. President, when we get a chance to vote on the Lee anti-vaccination amendment affecting healthcare workers in the military, I urge my colleagues to oppose the Lee amendment, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Louisiana.
I'm rising to support the amendment that my colleague, Senator John Kennedy, will introduce. So I speak before he introduces, but speak in support thereof. Senator Kennedy is going to introduce an amendment that would grant some disaster relief to several regions of the country, but I speak on behalf of those in Southwest Louisiana. A picture tells 1,000 words. If you recall that in 3 years ago that Hurricane Laura hit Southwest Louisiana. 2 weeks later, almost on the exact same track, Hurricane Delta followed up, destroying that which had not already been destroyed by Hurricane Laura. The devastation of these storms was dramatic. Now, I thank the American people. There has been aid that has been given by fellow Americans to these communities, but it's been less than that is required. And flying over, the picture tells 1,000 words. There's still blue tarps on top of roofs years after the storm is hit. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, blue tarps are when the roof has been destroyed, you place the tarp so that hopefully it provides protection that shingles otherwise would. When you're on the ground and you go through the neighborhood, there are homes that are blighted, boarded up, and as they have been boarded up, criminals have come in and businesses have closed. This particularly affects lower income communities. Those who have more resources, they're recovering. But those folks who need a little extra help, they are not. And so as we think about the aid that my fellow Americans are asked to give to their fellow Americans, I just will give some statistics. Hurricane Laura cost $19 billion in damages, Delta another $3 billion, and Ida, of course, not only hit West Louisiana, but caused $75 billion in damages from Louisiana to New York. There's a lot that's happened. I ask for additional support, as outlined in my colleague John Kennedy's amendment, to finish the recovery for these folks who have endured so much. I humbly ask my colleagues to support the amendment, and with that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I rise tonight to urge my colleagues to support the omnibus appropriation bill before us. The bill, Mr. President, represents a massive bipartisan effort that rests upon a framework that preserves all legacy riders, rejects poison pill policy provisions from both sides, and achieves dollar-for-dollar funding parity for defense and non-defense increases. As political compromise has become more and more difficult here, great credit, I believe, belongs to Chairman Leahy for making the tough choices that needed to be made and show leadership to reach this agreement tonight. The senior senator from Vermont, who also serves this body as the President Pro Tem, has accomplished many things in his long and his distinguished career. Each and every one of these accomplishments were made possible by his unparalleled ability to get things done, Mr. President, and this bill needed to get done. Mr. President, because the international security situation demands a greater emphasis on and investment in our national defense, this omnibus bill provides $782 billion for the Department of Defense and for other defense functions, $4 billion more than the level authorized by the National Defense Authorization Act, $30 billion more than the President Biden's budget request, and nearly $42 billion more than 2021. The bill, Mr. President, also provides an 11% increase over fiscal year 21 for the Department of Homeland Security, including $6.5 billion for much-needed investments in border security resources and a 7% increase for ICE operations. Critically, Mr. President, the package restores $2 billion in funding for wall construction on the southwest border. The bill also cuts nearly $65 billion in wasteful non-defense spending proposed in the Biden administration's budget, a nearly 10% decrease from the request level. Finally, the package, Mr. President, also provides critical emergency assistance to our military, to the Ukraine and our European allies without reducing base defense spending by a single dollar. Mr. President, is an omnibus appropriations bill ideal? I'll tell you tonight, the answer is no, it's not. but at this critical time and at this late date, it's necessary. My hope is, Mr. President, that we can pass this bill and use the same framework that made this bill possible as we begin the 23 appropriations process. Mr. President, I have no illusions that it will once again be it will not be a difficult process. It will be. I know that our chairman can get it done, and I look forward to continuing to work with Senator Leahy on the appropriations staff and with him one last time for both of us. Mr. President, before I complete my remarks, I would like to also recognize the incredible, and it is incredible, effort put forward by the staff members of both the Senate and House Appropriations Committees, as well as the staff of the respective leaders' offices. Without them, we couldn't be where we are tonight. We asked them to do the impossible, and they delivered, as they always do. And on behalf of the entire Senate, I want to thank them very, very much.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be given a minute to
Without
describe my
objection.
amendment and a minute to the senator from Washington.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's unkind for us to tell Americans, just moms and dads, ordinary people trying to live their lives, put food on the table, that they can't put food on the table and that they're going to be rendered unemployed and unemployable unless they defer to presidential medical orthodoxy. It's not who we are as Americans. It's especially not who we are if, as is the case with these mandates, there are not adequate provisions made for those with pre-existing medical conditions, for those with religious objections, and for those with natural immunity. That's what we're dealing with here. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's unkind, and we should not fund its enforcement. I plead with my colleagues to support my amendment to defund the enforcement of these mandates.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, we've had this debate before many, many times. Vaccines are safe, they're effective, and they are life-saving. Because of our ability to get safe and effective vaccines out to Americans, nearly 100% of our schools are open again. More than 90% of people in communities with low or medium levels of COVID, and people are finally getting back to a sense of normal in their everyday lives. Vaccines have helped to make that happen. Yeah, here we are once again. It's hard to believe this isn't the first or even the second time a few Senate Republicans have decided they want to risk a damaging government shutdown in order to oppose steps that save lives. But I hope for the sake of the people of this country, it's the last time this happens. There are problems real families want us to solve. They want us to bring down costs with steps like Democrats have proposed. They want us to stand up for democracy and the people of Ukraine who are facing a war and a humanitarian crisis. They want us to learn from this pandemic so we're better prepared for whatever is next. I'm going to focus on finding steps that we can actually take to help families, and I believe that is what most of us want to do. I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, which risks derailing this important bipartisan bill, delaying needed aid to Ukraine, and causing a dangerous government shutdown. I yield the floor.
Unanimous consent for 20 seconds to respond.
Objection.
Mr. President, it's not helpful to American families to threaten the breadwinner, the mom or the dad, or maybe both of them in some cases, with being rendered unemployed and unemployable, unable to put bread on the table. This is not about being anti-vaccine. I am not that, neither are any of the senators supporting this effort. This is about supporting American families. It's not supporting them to order them fired.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on amendment number 4989 offered by the senator from Utah, Mr. Lee. Is there a second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blackburn, Braun, Collins, Kramer, Fisher, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Lee, Portman, Risch, Scott of Florida, Shelby, and Thune. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Brown, Durbin, Feinstein, Hassan, Kelly, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, and Wyden. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Cantwell, Ms. Cantwell, no. Ms. Ernst, Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Miss Cinema, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Markey, no.
Should I? Okay. Does any senator wish to vote? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to.
President,
The Majority Leader.
could we have some order, please, Madam President? If we want to hasten the evening, I suggest everybody stay around, try to sit in your seats. We're going to try to limit these rest of the votes for 10 minutes to 10 minutes.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to the Braun Amendment number 4990.
Madam President,
The Senator from Indiana.
call up my amendment 4990 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will read.
The Senator from Indiana, Mr. Braun, for himself and others, proposes an amendment numbered 4990.
This bill, Madam President, has 367 pages worth of earmarks.
The Senate will be in order.
Roughly 5 pounds of paper. Before it came to the Senate, dozens of House offices deleted their public disclosures. I think the swamp is rising again. Dr. Tom Coburn, he would be appalled by this. He called earmarks.
The Senator will suspend.
I'll just speak louder, Madam President.
The Senator will suspend.
Earmarks.
I ask all senators to remove their conversations from the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Booker. I got you. I got you. I got you. Thank you. Ms. Duckworth. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Portman. Wicker, Collins. I got you. You're an I? I got you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Braun. I know I hate him. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Van Hollen. Thank you. Mr. Cassidy. Yeah, okay.
It's not the last vote. I just want it to be the last vote.
Thank you.
I mean, it doesn't affect me, but it...
Mr. Coons. Thank you. You're a no? Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher. Okay, I got you, thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King. I got you. Your no? Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. He did not answer. He voted no. He voted aye, sorry. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. I got you. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders. I have you as a no. Yeah, trying. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Gotcha. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Toomey, Tuberville, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Graham, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, King, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McConnell, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Oh, Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Moran, no. I'm about to. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. It was under 15. Thank you.
Have all senators voted? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 35, the nays are 64, and the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to Kennedy Amendment number 4983. The senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I call up my amendment number and Senator Cassidy's amendment number 4983 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Louisiana, Mr. Kennedy, for himself and Mr. Cassidy, proposes an amendment numbered 4983.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to be recognized for up to 2 minutes of debate. Senator Cassidy for 1 minute of debate and Senator Schatz for 2 minutes of debate prior to the vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Could we have order, Madam President?
Yes. Senators will remove their conversations from the floor.
Madam President, in 2020, Hurricane Laura hit Louisiana, then Hurricane Marco hit us, then Hurricane Delta hit us, then Hurricane Zeta, then Hurricane Ida, all in a period of 2 years. Those storms caused $150 billion in damage. My amendment and Senator Cassidy's amendment will appropriate $2.5 billion in disaster aid to Louisiana. That would include $600 million for housing aid for Hurricanes Laura and Delta, $1.4 billion in housing aid for Hurricane Ida. The amendment would also provide for $500 million in funding to rebuild Louisiana ports. I'm mindful of the fact, Madam President, that we should make sure this aid is paid for. I would remind everyone that through the heroic efforts of Senator Schatz and Senator Cantwell, in which I played a small part, that we forced our FCC not to give away the C-band to our telecommunications industry and instead auctioned it out, in which case it brought in $81 billion. And I think we can spare a little bit of that for people who lost their homes and businesses through no fault of their own. I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I'll add to what my colleague John Kennedy said. If you fly over Southwest Louisiana, you see blue tarps. Those tarps are there because the families have not had the money to replace their roofs. If you get on the ground, you see blighted neighborhoods. Those blighted neighborhoods where people have moved, their rooms are boarded up, criminals have entered, and those who have left are now prey to criminals. And as they've left, the businesses have closed. Madam President, we do so much in this country for those who have been injured. And we appreciate in South Louisiana all that has already been done. But there's a little bit more needed to particularly benefit those who are less well off. So I join my colleague, Senator Kennedy, in requesting that additional funding to complete the job started so Southwest Louisiana can become whole once more. With that, I yield.
President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Madam President. I respect my colleagues' desire to take care of the people and the needs of their state, and I agree there is a need not just in this state, but for a number of states that have been impacted by disasters in recent years. We must pass a disaster supplemental to provide funding for states fairly and based on need. We wish that the SUP were in this bill, but it was not agreed to by Republicans in the House and the Senate. Looking ahead, we ought to pass a bill to provide $2 billion and permanently authorize the CDBG DR program. As for pay-fors, this is an important point. The spectrum sale funds that my colleague suggests as a pay-for are already spoken for. That has already been used as a pay-for in previous bills, so we can't double count, and so unfortunately I urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you.
Is all time yielded back? The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun.
Yes, you were correct.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Arono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez.
Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney,
You can do it later.
Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative.
The Senate will be in order.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cruz, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Marshall, McConnell, Murkowski, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Lujan, Manchin, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Tillis, Warner, Warren, Wyden. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer.
I'm glad it's not me.
Aye.
But it's not on. Like, I turned it on and it's
Mr. Langford, Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Burr, Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly. No. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Ossoff. No. Mr. Warnock, Mr. Warnock. No. Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Hickenlooper. No. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. No.
Have all senators voted? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not on this vote, the yeas are 35, the nays are 64. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion to refer and the motion to concur with amendment number 4984 are withdrawn. The question occurs on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 2471. There are 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote. The Senate will be in order. Members should bring their conversations off the Senate floor.
Madam President?
The senator from Alabama.
Madam President, I've got a minute here, and I hope I won't use it all. Everybody wants to leave, and I understand. But this has been a lot of work to put this omnibus together. I want to thank Senator Leahy, his staff, the Republican staff, and everything else. This is a big improvement for defense. It's a big improvement for Homeland Security, and I think we've talked about what's in it and what's not, but I think overall it's something we should have done 6 months ago. I urge my colleagues to support the omnibus.
Madam President.
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, the distinguished senator from Alabama, Senator Shelby, and I have been friends for decades. I applaud his work on this. I applaud his staff. And I applaud our staff in the Appropriations Committee. I thank those senators in both parties who came together to come here. We stand up for America. We stand up for the needs of America. But we also stand up for Ukraine being attacked by a war criminal, Putin of Russia. I yield back my time. I ask for the yeas and nays.
The question is on the motion to concur. The yeas and nays have been requested. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Wicker's no. Wicker's aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Thank you. Mr. Bennett.
Marshall, no.
Thank you. Aye. To Ernst, Shaheen. Thank you. Collins. Thank you. Great. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Senator Sanders.
Gillibrand, aye.
Thank you. Casey, Duckworth. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you. Mr. Bozeman. So, what does Pastor? Yep, thank you. Thank you. Gotcha.
The SAS is at the back door.
Thank you.
Quiz me about anything in here.
You'll have the answer.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh, yeah.
You're a no? Thank you. Let's pass. Thank you. There you are. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yep. Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr. Thank you. I did. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein.
Got me the no, right?
I do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tony, I'm a no. I'm out of here.
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham. Mr. Lee.
You stamped this, right?
I did.
How's it look?
Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper. Thank you. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, I got you. Thank you. Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, I got you, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Portman, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tuberville, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Thank you. Yes, sir. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Cassidy, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Hawley, Hoven, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, Paul, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Tillis, and Toomey. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. I'm just buying a little time.
Got it. Does any senator wish to vote? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 68, the nays are 31. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this motion, the motion to concur is agreed to.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I'm delighted to see the vote. I thank the senators who voted with us. I would note that a lot of senators, I know Senator Shelby and I, but senators on both sides of the aisle work so hard in this. But I especially want to say again, I don't know how many times on weekends and evenings I could leave and go home at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, but our staff was still there at 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning doing this. They are the ones who deserve so much credit in getting this. This is the reality. This is our government. This is how we protect our country. But it's also how we show our responsibility to a country, in this case, Ukraine, is being attacked by a war criminal, Vladimir Putin. So I thank every senator who voted this way. I thank the distinguished majority leader who worked with us every step of the way to make sure we had the schedule so we could do this. I thank Republicans and Democrats who worked with us. I yield the floor.
Madam President, before I do all of these things, let me just thank Senator Leahy, who was so diligent and so relentless from 3, 4, 5 months ago, warning our caucus of the dangers, the very real dangers of a CR, which wouldn't have been able to move the government forward. And his hard work, his diligence, his dedication has been amazing. And I join him in thanking the great staff of the Appropriations Committee, who are second to none, as well as my staff, who worked very hard with them. Megan Tyra is another person you might be able to say wouldn't have happened without her. So it's a very good night for this country, a good bipartisan night, and I thank our senator from Vermont and our President Pro Tem, of course. Okay, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of House Con Res 79, which was received from the House.
The clerk will report.
H. Conres 79, directing the clerk of the House of Representatives to make a correction in the enrollment of H.R. 2471.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask that the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the motion to be reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table without intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res 75, which was received from the House and is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
House Joint Resolution 75, making further continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2022, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the joint resolution be considered read a third time.
Without objection.
I know of no further debate.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
And Madam
The
President,
joint resolution is agreed to.
I ask that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Calendar 209 S497.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 209 S497, a bill to establish the American Fisheries Advisory Committee and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S543 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 543, designating March 10, 2022 as National Slam the Scam Day and so forth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 726.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All of those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
No, sorry.
Nomination, Executive Office of the President, Shalonda D. Young of Louisiana to be Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar number 726, Shalonda D. Young of Louisiana to be Director of the Office of Management and Budget, signed by 16 senators as follows.
Read the first one. I want my name read because I
Schumer.
think she's great.
Padilla.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say
Aye.
all those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider Calendar 718.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
Nomination, Federal Labor Relations Authority, Susan Grunman of Virginia to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar number 718, Susan Grunman of Virginia, to be a member of the Federal Labor Relations Authority, signed by 16 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
Finally, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call for the cloture motions filed today, March 10th, be waived.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session and the EPW committee be discharged from further consideration of PN 1676, Corey Wiggins, to be federal co-chairperson, Delta Regional Authority, and the Senate consider the following nominations en bloc. Calendar PN 1676, 641, 776, 782, 785, 786, 787, and all nominations on the Secretary's desk in the Foreign Service, that the Senate vote on the nominations en bloc without intervening action or debate. The motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. That any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record. That the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question occurs on the nominations en bloc. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those no? Opposed, no? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
And finally, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 3 p.m. on Monday, March 14th, and that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. That upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Young nomination. Further, that the cloture motions filed during today's session ripen at 5:30 p.m.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 3 p.m. Monday, March 14th.